My advice to anyone when you're working in business is understand where the money comes in. Where money comes in, look at the customers and the opportunity to work with your customers on sustainability. When I was head of sustainability at Fujitsu, the company has a large data center footprint in Australia. There's a large carbon element to the amount of energy these big data centers use. So I'm thinking, imagine, a football field size full of servers using more energy in a small town. It was quite a lot of work to do, but I worked with the data center team, operations teams, got some investment in to do the first what's called neighbours rating here in Australia, which is the energy efficiency rating for a data centre. That was a key consideration for helping them win a major contract, multi-million-dollar contract for data centre hosting. It was a unique selling point that the sales teams could leverage and win more business.
Before we go into the podcast, if you could just go and rate this show on whichever platform you're listening to it, it makes a huge difference to the podcast, the amazing conversations we get to have, and the incredible guests we're able to get on the podcast. So it's probably not something you would think about, but if you could just go rate the show, follow it, or share an episode, it does make a huge difference to the show. Thank you so much. In a world increasingly facing the challenges of climate change, with the Building Green podcast, we will dive deep into the intersection of architecture, design, urbanism, and environmental responsibility. I'm Ladina Schipf, your host. I've been an architect and building site manager for the past 10 years. During my studies at ETH in Switzerland, as well as in my working environment, I've had many touchpoints with sustainability, like many of you, I guess. I've also learned to question what I've been told, which is why I decided to go deeper into the topic and uncover what sustainability actually means. My mission is to highlight the transformative power of sustainable architecture, not just as a practice, but as a catalyst for broader societal change. Subscribe for more of our content and enjoy the show. What if sustainability wasn't just a cost, but the greatest untapped opportunity for business growth? Lee Stewart has spent over 2 decades proving exactly that. As the former head of sustainability for Oceania at Fujitsu, Lee drove transformative initiatives, including securing Australia's first energy efficiency rating for a data center, a project that not only reduced emissions but helped win multi-million-dollar contracts. He's also the author of the book How to Build Sustainability into Your Business Strategy, where he distills 20 years of expertise into the CCC framework: confidence, commitment, and consistency, to help businesses integrate sustainability with purpose and profit. Now, through his consultancy ESG strategy, Lee mentors the next wave of sustainability leaders, ensuring businesses are prepared to meet the challenges of the future. In this episode, we'll dive into Lee's actionable approach to sustainability, how to align it with your business goals, and the game-changing lessons he's learned along the way. Lee, thank you so much for joining me on Building Green today. You've had a fascinating journey in sustainability. Can you tell me about the first moment or experience that got you interested in this field?
Yeah, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And I think if I go back early in my childhood, I was very fortunate enough to grow up in New Zealand, and you are just exposed to the magnificent outdoors and seeing nature at its best. And anywhere in New Zealand you could go, you're so privileged. Less than an hour drive anywhere. You can be in the mountains, you can be in the wilderness, you can be in the ocean. It's just a lovely, fascinating place to grow up in and then appreciation of the outdoors. Where I really got my key focuses on was in my very early age, around 8 or 9, I joined a nuclear-free protest with my dad in the street. And New Zealand still proudly is a nuclear-free nation. And big moment in the history of the time in the 80s for New Zealand was to become nuclear free. And that was sort of where I got my sort of passion and drive to actually work to become a better place, keep that work going. So sort of ingrained in me from an early age.
That's super interesting. And what took you then later on where you are today?
Yeah, look, I obviously went through university and was very fortunate enough to get a job transfer to Sydney. I worked in telco and finance. And then went to London for, as all the young people do, use your visa and use 2 years working in Europe. And in Europe, I was exposed to online education and learning. I took that knowledge back to Sydney, and I was very young and also naive at certain times, but I did a lot of startups, and I did startups around building online education around sustainability. and won some really lovely clients. And that business raised some capital, and that business did okay. It's still going on in some shape or form, but after a while of working in sort of wearing a lot of t-shirt and jeans, I had to swap that for a suit again because I had a young family on the way. So I had to get the regular cash flow and get a job. And I was very fortunate enough to get my first job in a global IT company called Fujitsu, where I was the lead sustainability consultant for New South Wales, and then soon became the head of sustainability for Oceania for that, and where I stayed for 8 years, which is a really great grounding in sustainability from around 2010s onwards.
That's so cool. And you recently published a book. Before we talk about that, what got you to write that book in the first place?
Yeah, look, I spent 20 years working in this corporate sustainability, and I wrote the book out of there's two reasons. First of all, I was burnt out in corporate sustainability. My last role was really heavy, and I kind of left that. And I was wondering, geez, what can I do? I was questioning yourself, thinking about your purpose and whatever, And I started talking to some friends, and they sort of said, well, you've actually got a really good story to tell. You've got a lot of good experience. So I said, yeah, look, I need to write that book, something I've been thinking about for a while. So the book was actually written out of also frustration of where I've seen corporate sustainability go, the amount of jargon the industry uses, the amount of, opaqueness to it. And I think, look, there's really needs to be some sort of simplification business language book around sustainability that resonates with everyone. So I really spend a lot of time talking to people about what matters most. How do I articulate this in a common language so that anyone can pick up this book, understand it, and get some value out of it? And also, I know you and I, and probably a lot of your listeners have always been to these conferences on sustainability or any conference, and you think, oh my God, that person just spoke for 2 hours and they could have said that in 5 minutes. So I'm trying to compress as much knowledge of 20 years into a 3-hour read as possible, which was really hard. But I wanted to respect the reader's time to say that here's what you really need to know. Yes, there's a lot of other information out there, which I do encourage you to do, still stay curious. But here's what you really need to know to set a climate target or have a good strategy or to understand what you need to know about the global macro issues and how that matters to your business. And here's a really simple process that gets you underway.
Very excited to going into that process and learning those 20 years of experiences and knowledge and putting those in 40 minutes. So the book you published, How to Build Sustainability into Your Business Strategy, walk through a simple framework, as you just said, of 3 key things people need to know.
Yeah. And I'm sorry to your listeners, I come up with another framework, and I know there's so many frameworks in sustainability and stuff, but I designed this as the simplest framework to understand, and it is called the triple C. So there's 3 C's, and it stands for confidence, commitment, and consistency. So if I talk about very quickly, confidence is what I mentioned earlier, is the global macro issues of, say, what is modern slavery, climate change, waste, diversity, what are these big global macro issues, but what does it actually mean to my business, and what do I really need to know about them? So we take through, what is climate change, what is carbon, those sort of things in a very simplified, compressed way. And it's not everything. You will need to go learn some other bits, but it's what you need to know. So that's confidence. So the next part is the commitment phase. So this is understanding what matters most to your business before you make those commitments. So if you run off and do a climate target, you might want to understand how big your carbon footprint is first, those sort of things. What matters most to your business through a materiality assessment, asking stakeholders, making sure you don't run off and do, hey, we're going to go through and do a whole net zero roadmap and strategy when you're only got 20 tons of carbon. That's not relevant to your business. You're better off focusing on what matters most or where you can have the biggest impact. So go out and ask people, refine that process and focus on 3 or 4 key things. That's what you're looking at. And then the final bit, which I see a lot of companies really fall over, is they launch their climate strategy or a sustainability strategy with a lot of marketing and fanfare, but they forget about it. In a year's time, they're going to have to report on what they've done and how they're moving towards those targets. So they forget about the last C, which I talk about, is consistency. And really what that looks at is the governance model of how you set around the reporting or the management of your targets and what you stand for and your commitments. So I've seen a lot of organizations where someone gets promoted or moves on or leaves the business, and it all hangs in the small sustainability team of 1 or 2 people, where it's not distributed across the business with a governance model, and they're at least reporting on those targets quarterly. So there's not a big surprise when they come to an annual report or they've asked questions and so forth. They don't know where the answers are. They're working continuously towards that goal, and they've got that consistency in place. So the book's just split into those 3 key sections, and it's supported with short videos as well. And there's worksheets I'm working on now, so you can actually go through it, read the book, and actually structure your own strategy as you go through it.
That's so cool. So if we go into the confidence section, what are the most important things we need to know?
Yeah, look, when you think about, I focus a little bit here on, it's a given that climate change is probably the most common one, and most people be familiar with this. A lot of companies are setting climate targets and so forth. So if you're new to this, you need to understand what your baseline is and why does it matter to your business. But also scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions are quite useful in that context, especially for the smaller to medium-sized enterprises, scope 3 emissions and why it matters. And just quickly to rehearse, but scope 3 are the emissions in your supply chain. But as a supplier to a large company, I'm working with organizations now, they're being asked for the first time, what is your carbon footprint of your products, you suppliers? Because the person you're supplying needs to report on that, and it probably might have set maybe a science-based target and needs to understand what you're doing to reduce your emissions. So you're seeing that just sort of flow downhill from the large organizations across to smaller organizations. So having the confidence to understand that question before it's asked from a key supplier is sometimes critical, because having worked with those other key suppliers, I know in very short time frame, they'll be making calls on whether to do business with you or not in the future, maybe based on that number that you might or might not know, and based on their level of confidence whether you can reduce that carbon number in the future. So that's just one example of that sort of confidence side of things.
And how about the commitment phase? How do you know what you need to focus on specifically in your business?
The key thing which most sustainability people know, and you'll see in some sustainability reports, mostly done every couple of years, is what's called a materiality assessment. So I do a number of these for organizations, or I help coach organizations how to do it themselves. But it's interviewing. You probably start with your executive team, your board, interviewing them in a structured way to understand what matters most to them. What do they see as the biggest strengths and weaknesses around sustainability in the organization? Also, where do they see 5, 10, maybe even further years ahead? What's important to the business? One key question I really like to ask, especially the executive and board, is this question. You ask it for yourself too in your business, but one key question I really like asking is, if your business did not exist today, would the world, society, or environment be better or worse off? And I'm normally met with silence with that, and there's a number of different responses I've get, but the answer to that question is quite revealing in terms of where you currently are. So a lot of companies would say, well, it'd be worse off. You go, and so the question I follow up is, why would you say that? Well, someone would take our place that wouldn't care as much. Okay, well, why do you care as much? Oh, it's because we do X, Y, and Z, or we look after our employees, or we look after our supply chain, or we have a waste management program for that product, or we have a climate target. These are all parts of your sustainability strategy, which you might not have formulated, but they sort of reveal your strengths, your weaknesses, and also the opportunities by asking that question. So really like that question in the materiality assessment. And then also, once you've sort of done these sort of interviews, you might want to do a survey to go to all staff or other suppliers, or interview suppliers as well. Customers are good. Also maybe include NGOs as well. In previous roles I've included activist groups, even Extinction Rebellion, World Wildlife Fund, Greenpeace, to feed into that information. So it's important to get all perspectives, but then you go through a process of filtering it out, what matters most. So when I see organizations with 30, 40 commitments, you kind of think, oh, it's pretty unlikely. Or if you see someone doing all of the 17 SDGs and they're targeting all of them, you kind of, well, I don't think a government can do that. So what makes your company able to do that? Where I see companies go, we've gone through this process, We know these are all really important issues, but where we have the biggest influence and where we have the biggest impact is these 3 or 4 things. When they've gone through that, that's like, yep, they've really nailed it in terms of what they need to focus on. And then the next stage is, what are they actually going to do about it? So that's the key. So that's how you get to understanding what matters most to your business.
That's super interesting. And in terms of consistency, what's like 1 or 2 actionable tips that you think are often overlooked?
Yeah, what I do like is taking those 3 or 4 key things from your materiality assessment and having a plan for each of them. All right. And having an executive, if you're a large enough organization, having an executive accountable for that. So the head of operations might be accountable for the climate target, for instance, and he or she needs to report at least quarterly on activities and going on, to a sustainability steering committee, governance model, and so forth. Some of the companies I work with do it monthly, some do it quarterly. Ideally, at least that quarterly cadence, so you've got people accountable. So say that person, the chief operating officer, will report on every quarter. Here's where we're tracking emissions. Here's these projects. We might be, say, transitioning our forklifts from LPG to electric or something, or our fleet is moving to electric. These are the sort of incremental changes we've done over the last quarter. Here are some of the challenges we have. Here's the sort of funding gaps we might have and so forth around that. And then, for instance, you might have a diversity target, and it makes sense. Maybe the head of HR or people and culture might own that. So they would have, what are they doing around bridging the pay gap between men and women in the organization? Do they have the numbers, or are they going to publicize that? How are they going to ensure they have more women in leadership? How are they making sure their job applications are more applicable to Indigenous people, or getting those sort of through the organization, and have a series of projects that support that, say, pillar of the strategy. So those are the key tips, is accountability, because I've seen far too many times you might have a sustainability person in an organization. They can't be responsible for everything. They're the traffic controller of that. They can't go, here, put $1 million into a decarbonisation project, because quite honestly, they don't have the budget. They can't suddenly go get HR to change all their processes. They need to direct the traffic across the group of the organization and keep them accountable. So where I see it working best in these governance meetings is where initially the sustainability person might be talking a lot, but towards the end of the meeting, where I know we've done our job, is we're not talking at all. Everyone's talking about it, and you might be just taking the minutes and notes, and maybe even someone else is doing that. That's when you see the maturity organization lift.
That's very interesting. And so at your company ESG strategy, you work with clients to align those sustainability goals with business growth. Can you walk me through the most important aspects you look at when advising those clients?
Yeah, look, there's a number of factors. More is the key drivers for that. And to be totally frank, altruism is not a long-term driver, just because it's the right thing to do. There really needs to be some other driver. So that the key clients I'm working with now have either it's their a funder, their financiers said you must have a climate target, or their large owner, asset owners, you must have a sustainability strategy or program, or a customer. A customer driver is really key too, saying you supply us with this equipment, you need to have a sustainability strategy. Or to my previous conversation before, the scope 3 emissions, we need to know what your emissions are because you provide products and services to us. We need to start accounting for that. And guess what? We've set a target to that. In the next 5 years, we need to reduce by 50%. So what are you going to do to help us with that target? And in your future procurement decisions, it probably will be a factor coming on. The other driver, which is also good, but not as, it's a reluctant one for a lot of companies, is the regulation side of things. But you'll see a lot of companies just try and tick the box of regulation, where the intent of the regulation is probably to build a more sustainable, resilient business that's not wrecking the planet or society. But generally you'd see, and quite rightfully in some cases, businesses think, oh, it's just another piece of regulation, we just need to comply. So those are the sort of 3 drivers. Of the ones I really like to work with clients is where a customer is really asking for it, because that opens up great conversations around innovation, opportunity to actually grow your market share with that customer, because you might have the upper hand on your competitors. to say, well, we're already working on this, or we can set these targets, but what else would you like us to do to help you meet yours as a supplier? So that's where it gets really interesting, where you talk about sustainability not as a nice to have or a risk mitigation, but to a value creation. That's when that really shifts the dial, and that's where we get into some exciting areas.
It's very cool. Can you talk about a few projects or a few businesses where you had like an exciting turn?
Yeah. Look, I suppose there's one which I really talk about where I was when I was head of sustainability at Fujitsu, and we had large data centers, and we still do. Company has a large data center footprint in Australia, large energy users, and Australia is mainly, a largely fossil fuel driven coal-fired power stations. So there's a large carbon element to the amount of energy these big data centers use. So I'm thinking, imagine, a football field size full of servers using more energy than a small town. A new standard came in around energy efficiency where it was quite a lot of work to do, but I worked with the data center team, the operations teams, got some investment in to do the first what's called neighbours rating here in Australia, which is the energy efficiency rating for a data center. That was a key consideration for helping them win a major contract worth multi-million-dollar contract for data center hosting. So, but we had to do that about a year in advance. I was all the time selling them the opportunity, if this happens. And then it finally did. It was a great unique selling point that the sales teams could leverage and win more business. So I would go and support the sales teams and helping them articulate, the bids and the large contracts. They're trying to win a large government contract or another large business contract. They have a climate target, and you can say, well, if you move to us, we'll help you achieve that target, and articulating that. So that's one key area. And sort of my advice to anyone when you're working in business is understand where the money comes in. Where money comes in, look at the customers and the opportunity to work with your customers on sustainability.
That's very cool. And how do you usually help businesses identify and measure the ROI of their sustainability efforts?
Yeah, first of all, it's generally quite hard for that. The return on investments is a lot of areas are done around energy efficiency is obviously a very relatively easy one, although some of the complications around that, factoring in the future cost of carbon pricing as well. So there's a lot of intangibles there. The key one, which I mentioned before, is if I worked on bids, I would ask if it was successful, what was the percentage of sustainability contributed to that bid? And you'd have that number at the end of the year, which I'd present to my CEO to help him understand what I did and so forth. So there are different ways of understanding ROIs, but you probably need to work into the business to get the context right. So I had to go to the sales teams, I had to go to the head of sales and ultimately the CEO to say, is this metric okay to how I measure performance of sustainability in the sales process? I said, yes. So keep doing that. So you've got to actually delve a little bit deeper and understand the business a bit more. But definitely there are opportunities there.
And when it comes to convincing boards or clients about sustainability, what's the one piece of advice you would give or you think architects or developers need to hear?
Yeah, especially, I suppose, know your audience. So boards are very different to the customer side of things. So in dealing with boards, I've found you can't rush it. I've made so many mistakes, like when I've jumped straight into commitment phase where the board is not confident. Like they don't know what a carbon is. And one example was, it's probably to my own detriment, I was maybe a little bit arrogant too and naive, whereas I had a new client where I was only talking about 200 tons of carbon, where my previous job was talking around 20 million plus. And I just thought, oh God, I'll just write a quick note of why they need a climate target. But no, I had to go back to the whole waterfall chart and how we're going to do it incrementally, because it didn't matter the number. What the board still didn't understand was what a carbon was, what is a climate target, why do we need it, how we're going to get there, what's the risk of me signing off on this, how bad am I going to look, how good am I going to look, what are others doing, are we way out there as a leader or are we a laggard? So with the board, it's really, you've got to lay the breadcrumbs over time. You can't rush it. And what I also found with the board is also context is really good. Understanding where your business fits amongst your competitors and peers. So I've had to do a lot of analysis around where you sit today on, say, here's a climate target, leaders are out here, and maybe you're in the middle of the pack. And what you're doing is, a lot of clients I want to work with generally are conservative boards. They don't want to be way out on the leading edge because they think, oh, we're going to get shot, we're going to get burnt, we're going to waste a lot of money, a lot of effort, we're going to be embarrassed, we're going to get on the wrong side of regulators and so forth. But what they want to understand is they're not way at the back as well. So and it was really useful in one previous, just recent engagement with the board. They understood, okay, well, they thought they were leaders, but they actually look in the context of the market. You're actually not. You need to do a few things. And so that's been quite useful, the context. Similar with sort of architects and construction people working with clients is very interesting, is to understand your client's objectives, goals and targets, and look for that alignment piece is key. And what I've really found, if you can become knowledgeable in sustainability, you can pretty much have a conversation with any customer. And that's quite door opening. You can just even say, look, hey, we're looking at updating our sustainability strategy, or we're looking at doing our first sustainability strategy. Can I interview you as part of the materiality assessment? That's been gold in understanding what your customers want and helps you with your sales strategy as well as your sustainability strategy. So be really open about it. And then there's opportunities to collaborate with customers, especially in construction, where no one company can solve it all. You might want to look at, hey, let's work on a waste program together with regional councils or jurisdictions, or let's look at renewable energy opportunities and things like that. Most customers that you work with will be keen to have those conversations.
If you're enjoying the show, I have a small favor to ask that would mean the world to me. By rating and sharing the podcast, you're helping us grow and spreading our mission of making sustainability really desirable and cool to a wider audience. Besides of that, imagine impressing your colleagues with the latest insights on sustainable architecture. So make sure you follow the podcast and become the most informed in the room. Thank you so much for your support. I think often architects or developers, especially architects, focus on their project and how it looks, how it feels, program and all that. And they forget to ask questions about the goals of the board, let's say, or of the client. So that's super helpful to understand what is it that the client wants and how can I design a building that delivers those results. And in terms of interviewing your clients, what kind of questions would you ask them?
Yeah, it's obviously do some research up front, but it's more like some key questions I'd like to ask is, what would you like to see from us as the business, and what areas do you think we could collaborate on in helping you achieve your targets and goals? What do you see in 5 years' time? Key suppliers having, what are the attributes of a key sustainability supplier, or and also what weighting do you give on sustainability today? Is that moving up or down the scale? Another key one is, what information disclosures do you want from suppliers now and in the future? So a lot of them might just say, hey, I just need to see your a policy on modern slavery. Great. In 5 years' time, are you going to need to see us do something with that policy or have programs in place? How do you help use that to design your future program and future investment and requirements needed? So always have a lens to the future, not just the now, because generally you're seeing more and more requirements will become on your customers, maybe pushed down through regulation and their customers. So I don't think it's an area where you can stand still too long before you get left behind.
What's the most common mistake businesses make when they are trying to integrate sustainability into their strategy?
They think it's a one-off. Like, hey, we've got a sustainability report and a strategy. We're done. We move on to the next thing. It takes that consistency piece I spoke about where they forget about it. That's where they get really let down. And they'll be found out. There are companies now that are starting to report 2 or 3 years down the track that are sort of regurgitating the same stuff that haven't really shifted the dial. And they're going to start to get found out.
That makes a lot of sense. So, Lee, we have talked about the first questions that you ask your clients.
Yep.
And again, you often ask them about their USP in a way, their unique selling proposition. If you had to answer that question for yourself or for ESG strategy, what would you say makes you different?
Yeah, I think it's, I've now got some other senior partners on board, and it's the fact that we've actually been inside organizations as head of sustainability roles. We understand from the client's perspective. We haven't been consultants all our careers. The other one, I suppose, is we take a practical, pragmatic approach and we partner with our clients. I've worked so many times with consultants where they just lob a report over the fence and walk away. What we do is my goal is to actually train more leaders in the future. So what I'm working now for half a dozen clients right now is kind of a virtual or fractional chief sustainability officer. And I'm very proud that, 2 or 3 of my clients are now dropping off the amount of work they give us because I've helped them hire and mentor their first sustainability manager who will hopefully future be a chief sustainability officer someday for organizations. So it's that sort of mentoring and partnership, because the world needs more sustainability leaders, but they also need more well-trained sustainability leaders. And what I'm seeing is in organizations, people in sustainability probably don't have the right mentors around them because they're just not there, and they're pushing a lot of agendas that are very awkward, and a lot of them burn out. I've burnt out multiple times in this career. So there's a need to be a lot of support for them. So this is where our niche area is, to help develop the future leaders by becoming that virtual chief sustainability officer, setting up the programs as I've designed in the book. And then through that process, we find someone internally, ideally, who's passionate, who's curious enough, who knows the business, can actually step into a sustainability role. Or in one case, I've helped, or actually multiple cases, I've helped them hire and recruit and then mentor them into the role. So it's a different approach that I think works really well.
That's so cool. So you don't just give advice and some strategies, so you make sure that they have someone that can do it. Really cool. And what are the most important aspects you teach or you mentor the head of sustainability in?
Well, the most important thing is to sort of, I suppose, it's to have an extra sounding board to back yourself. And it is really hard. And I've been in these board meetings where you walk into a room and just because of your title, you feel the tension that this person's here to kill the golden goose of the business, right? He's here to tell us that, the world's dying and we need to spend all our money and stop selling these products that are killing the planet. So it's really hard. So I really think those sort of chief sustainability roles is one of the toughest gigs around. You got to you'd be expected to know everything, and there's more coming on your plate. So what I really want those to do is, and I really work with some of them right now, is not become the agitator in the business, but the collaborator. So not to become the doer of everything, but empower others to do, like sort of that governance model around that commitment thing phase I spoke about. It's the same if your team cannot do everything, but you've got to be that appropriate traffic control and collaborator to get moving. So it's a different mindset. Whereas I've been guilty of this, where I come in a room and I go, oh, Lee's in the room. That's cool. He's got the climate target. He's sorting out the waste problem. And also, hey, we've got a diversity issue over here and we need a modern slavery report. You got that, Lee? Cool. And I've got a team of 2 people, and it needs to be done in the next 3 months. So that's just not going to work anymore. So we really need to empower the chief sustainability officers and those sort of roles to be the collaborator and not the doer of everything.
That makes sense. And what was like your most controversial client in a way? Maybe someone who came in, you saw their product and you thought, that's not sustainable at all. How can we make this happen?
Oh, yeah, there's been many issues, and there's some companies you just won't touch, you just know. But, look, there's, and you do work with large, and I've worked with large polluters and stuff. You have that chat to yourself, am I doing the right thing? But when you find out very quickly how genuine they are, and I just recently had a large client which is all fossil fuels, petroleum based, but in an hour chat with the CEO, you know how genuine they are, and that's been really good. So very nervous about going into talking to these clients first, but they know the transition, they know the writings on the wall about fossil fuels and stuff, and they want to work on that orderly transition phase around that with us, which is really exciting. And then there are just some that just need a compliance need. You can gauge very quickly whether they want to go beyond compliance and so forth. But in some respects, that's an opportunity to actually help educate them better, because a compliance might be need to sign off by the board, but you might have that 20 minutes or a half hour or an hour workshop with the board saying, well, you understand the meaning of this regulation was to maybe create a better, resilient and more competitive business. Is that of interest to you? So that's how you can use those levers appropriately. But yeah, definitely there've been some clients where you just go, look, hey, it's not working. You're better off working with someone else.
Talking about government regulations, you mentioned
Yep.
it before a little bit. Where do you see room for improvements?
Yeah, look, my biggest fear, I'll just talk about my fear around this, but there's a lot of climate related disclosures coming into play, right? So what is your impact on climate change, and what is the financial risk to your business? Both transitional and the physical risks. My biggest fear is that's being now semi-hijacked by finance, which is good in some respects. But if you think about how accountants and finance are trained, it's either black or white. They really struggle with the ambiguity of looking at a 5, 10, 30-year time frame, and the ambiguity of a climate risk of a 1.5 degree world to a maybe 3 or 4 degree world. So yes, finance should probably own the reporting side of things, but they need to make sure they work closely, say, with the sustainability team and other people that have a wider lens rather than the black and white compliance, and ability to go out to the business and seek the risks and opportunities and understand that a bit better. So that's where I see my concern around that is. But also the other concern is that it's another thing that's been just lumped on sustainability, which is well under resourced, and I've yet to meet a company that really says they've got a proper resource sustainability team, or a chief sustainability officer for that matter, that says, hey, I'm well resourced, I've got all the budgets and everything I need. I've yet to really find someone that does that. If you do, please let me know. I'll give that company a huge tick. So that's my concern around regulation and it gets washed away. What is the intent? Why did the government set this regulation? Always try to look back to that and reframe that, not just get dived down into section 5C says we must do X, Y, and Z. Okay, that's good, but what's the real intent behind it as well? Don't lose sight of that.
And you also mentioned the neighbors energy rating system in Australia, which you said made a huge impact. Can you share how it works and why it's such a great example?
This is a really good example of where government regulation has made a good impact. So NABERS stands for National Australian Built Energy Rating Scheme. It came out over a decade ago, and what it was designed for was, you've got Green Star, for which all your architects might know, and it might be LEED standards and so forth. I'm sorry, I'm not sure what the European one is, but where you build something to an energy efficiency standard. But there's also a lot of building stocks out there that don't have this and need to know how efficient is it in energy. And if I'm a tenant, I'm looking to buy or purchase thousands of square meters of floor space for my company, how do I know what the energy efficiency rating of that building is and what are my costs going to be and so forth? So Australia came up with a scheme to rate them from 1 to 5 stars, 5-star being the most energy efficient, 1 being not efficient. But one key thing they did was, if you're going to advertise floor space, this is just general office space, you must advertise the neighbours rating. So it became a competitive thing. So listed property funds would say, well, no, but in the next 5 years, all our building stock will be 4.5 star or greater. And then the Australian government got on board and said, well, in the next 2 or 3 years, we'll only lease space with 4 stars or greater for our own people that work in government. So all of a sudden you had these building upgrades. You had a lot of energy and efficiency people spring up and help, retrofit energy efficiency, so forth in buildings. Building management systems come up, verifications and so forth. But they also set up, the government, what was really smart, set up a separate entity that looked after the scheme. So you had to go and get your rating done every year and verified and assessed and train assessors and so forth. So it's grown from now just buildings to data centers, which I spoke about earlier. There's shopping centers. There's now coming schools and other ratings. And it's really driving the financial imperative too, when they look at their building stocks. And if you're going to build it, it's going to be built to a 5-star or better. Or if you're going to upgrade a building, if you don't upgrade the neighbors rating, then why are you actually doing it? So it's been really good, that scheme.
That's super interesting. And any other trend in sustainability that excites you?
Oh, it excites me and scares me at the same time, but it's becoming more mainstream. Like I've been going to conferences for many years where there was only about 30 or 40 people. Now there's 400, 600, 800 people going along. There's a lot more interest and there's a lot more focus on it. So that's really exciting about it's when I used to say maybe the barbecue conversations we have here in Australia 10 years ago, I'd say I work in sustainability. People go, what's that? Now they know what it is, at least. So that's been really good. There's more mainstreaming of it. But my concern, what frightens me is that the capability gap is growing, I suppose. There's not many people with actual real sustainability experience out there. There's a lot of people wanting to jump in. So we've got to make sure that they have the right training background and skills to actually make an impact.
So if someone out there wants to become a really good sustainability leader, they should come to you for a good training.
Yeah, or read the book. That's what I wrote. The book's a good start. And I will be planning on launching sort of online mentoring and stuff. I've got in the background. I've got worksheets and videos and more courses and training. So the idea around the book was to make it more accessible to those people that suddenly come into the conferences, give them something tangible they could work on and something that's pragmatic.
Can you share a time or a story when a sustainability project didn't go as planned? Like, what lessons do you learn?
There's been a lot. And one thing which I really reflect on, and it comes back down to the confidence piece, where I'm trying to push through a climate target without the confidence, and I needed to take more time. And early in my career, I used to try to rush things. I was running around trying to do things, whereas people learn at different paces. And people are coming from, especially the topic of climate change, it is one of those, I talk about in the book, a wicked problem, which means it's really hard. Some people would be at so diverse areas of the spectrum of way out there saying we're not doing enough. Some people saying, well, why should we bother? It's not important. And it's politicized and it gets a real grunty project. So the lessons I've learned where haven't gone well, or things haven't gone too well for me, is where I haven't read the room properly. Where I haven't done, and I learnt this in Fujitsu days, a great word called nemawashi, which is a Japanese word for stakeholder engagement, where my boss at the time, she had to go through 80 iterations plus of the sort of global sustainability strategy. But the nemawashi was one-on-one conversations with everyone before you went to the decision. And when you're going for a big decision in a boardroom, ideally that decision is already made before you're fronting it, because you've got to the people in the room and you've understood where their questions are coming from. And hopefully it's a mere formality of getting this through. Those are the times where you rush things. And when you rush things and without understanding or having 2 or 3 friendlies in the room, knowing where they're coming from, you're kind of the sacrificial lamb at times. And those sort of meetings don't really end well for me and haven't in the past. So it's kind of, I'd be reluctant to go to a board or a big decision without at least talking to 3 or 4 people in the room beforehand, if you can. That'd be my key thing.
That makes a lot of sense, kind of tie down
Yeah.
all of them.
Yeah.
And how can architects and urban planners better bridge this gap between sustainable design and business goals?
Yeah, I think it's just have conversations and informal conversations, more of those. So if you're an architect, just wanting to understand your client better, just ask them for have a coffee and stuff and have some ideas around, sustainability or some very informal questions to build that rapport better. I've always found that as key. So generally, if I'm with a customer and stuff, working a project, I say, look, can I buy you lunch? Can we have a coffee? You're on site. Can we just have a general chat and get to know those key stakeholders better as a person? It generally helps. Early in my career, I was in some sales. So I had the strategy of, it was really hard. I was cold calling and doing sales, but I said, well, let's just try to become their friend. And if you become their friend, it's harder for them to, not tell you lies and work. It's easy to work with. And so I've created a lot of friends throughout my career. So have that sort of mentality. You don't have that sort of adversarial client architect sort of relation grinding stuff. Try to become their friend, understand where they're coming from, especially if they're really against sort of what you're doing around sustainability. You can sort of try and understand where they're coming from, put yourself in their shoes. One thing is I've felt how I get people over the line in some of these conversations is not your point of view. It's showing what governments are doing, what other customers are doing, what competitors are doing. And in some cases, you've got to, what I've done, I've got out of the way of that conversation of filtering it, where I had some time with the board. I said, I don't want that time. You talk directly to our biggest customer who wants to tell you exactly what's going on and what they expect of you in terms of sustainability. Is that okay? And I don't even want to be in the room. Yeah, fine. So, sometimes you got to do that as well.
That's cool. Like, take yourself out and
hear directly from the source, right?
Yeah. That's really cool. So, Lee, I have one last question for you. What's one common myth about sustainable business that you'd love to debunk?
It's the largest untapped value creation for any business. I'm quite confident of that. It's not a cost. It's not an impost. It's an opportunity.
And comes with a lot of strategy, right?
Yeah, when done properly, it's such a major unlock, and you not only will create more value for your business, but you'll feel better about it, and your people will too. They all want to work for a company that just looks beyond profit.
Thank you so much, Lee. Is there anything else you want to share that you think we've missed?
No, not at all. It's been a pleasure to be on the show. Really enjoyed it. But if people want to find out more about me, you can look up my book on Amazon, How to Build Sustainability Business Strategy, and Lee Stewart, just LeeStewart.com.au. You can find more information there. Subscribe to my website. You can get access to some video content as well, some extra resources coming out, and stay abreast of what's going on.
That's really cool. I'll definitely link your book, your LinkedIn, and your website in the description of the episode. Thank you very much, Lee.
Cool. Thank you.
A huge thank you for listening. Make sure you subscribe to the show wherever you listen to the podcast to support me and so you don't miss an episode. And while you're there, I'd also be so grateful if you could rate and review us. If you have any guest suggestions or any feedback, you can find me on the socials at @LadinaShipf. Thanks.